Good evening and welcome, everybody. My name is Manira Sandhir. I'm the planning manager with the Community Development Department here at the City of San Mateo. We're very excited to host this workshop on the historic resource preservation efforts that the city is doing, and also to educate and inform the community about how historic preservation works at the local, state, and the federal level. I have a big team with me here, so I will briefly introduce everybody. So to start with, we are joined from the city side with the Community Development Department Director, Interim Director, Zachary Dahl. We have Senior Planner Rendell Bustos. We also have Assistant City Manager Christina Horaceberger. We have Erin Fellers from the City Clerk's Office supporting us with the Zoom logistics. On the technical side, we are joined by folks from the Architectural Resources Group who are consultants to the city, John Rush and Sarah Hahn. And then facilitating the conversation tonight, we have from Public Dialogue Consortium, Sean Spano and Jennifer Meyer. And, we really appreciate all the questions that some of the attendees tonight sent us in advance, and we look forward to answering them and enabling a community dialogue about this topic. So with that, I will turn it over to Sean to take it away.
Very good. Thank you, Manira. Sean Spano, as she mentioned, with the Public Dialogue Consortium, and we are an independent, small firm that specializes in community engagement, and Jen and I have done many of these community engagement meetings, and we're really looking forward to working with you all this evening. So welcome to the meeting, and as Manira just said, you've met the staff and you've met the facilitators. And so let's move forward onto the next slide, and I'll take a couple minutes and get us organized here on how we'll be spending our time together this evening. So meeting purposes, there are two meeting purposes. One, provide information and create a shared understanding of historic resource designation and processes for historic preservation in San Mateo. Second purpose is to facilitate questions and comments to ensure accurate information and a baseline common understanding. So let me briefly expand on these two purposes with a couple additional points. One, historic resource designation is a complex and technical topic. I think many of you know that. On the complex side, all three levels of government, federal, state, and local, are involved in the historic designation processes. Note the plural there, processes. So it can be very complex, also very technical, requiring specialized knowledge and professional expertise when you really want to go below the surface and fully understand the nuances and intricacies of these designation processes. Now, thankfully, we have two experts here tonight. You just met them, John Rush and Sarah Hahn from the Architectural Resources Group, along with planning staff from the Community Development Department. Their job tonight is to provide accurate and complete information without getting overly technical or going too deep into the details. That's a really challenging task, but no doubt they're up for it. Your assignment, participants tonight, is to listen and learn in order to affirm, broaden, and deepen your understanding of historic designation and preservation and how it applies to San Mateo. Now, the second point I want to make here has to do with the specific application that's been submitted to designate the Baywood neighborhood as a historic district. I'm assuming that's why most of you are attending this meeting. Maybe all of you are attending this meeting because of that. As you probably know, the application was submitted to the State Historic Preservation Office. So as a result of that, the city is not a party to the application. The city has not taken a position on the application. What the city is focused on is updating the general plan, and the general plan will include policies and options related to historic designation and preservation in San Mateo. We're going to outline the next steps in the process here, and so we have a slide later on in the meeting that articulates what's going to happen at the city with the general plan and how that relates to historic designation and preservation. So the point here I want to make is the specific Baywood application is not the primary focus of tonight's meeting. Instead, we are focused on the rules, processes, and conditions that govern any historic resource application, including historic districts. So just to remind you, this is an information and learning session. Now, I suspect there's going to be a lot of community discussion, debate, and dialogue on the Baywood application as the process unfolds. That's a good thing. That's healthy for democracy. It's healthy for local government. Tonight's meeting is really about learning the processes, the conditions, and the rules that can be very technical and complex. And that's going to make for a better debate, discussion, and dialogue when people have accurate information and a shared understanding about how the processes work. If we could move on, please, to the next slide. So with that in mind, those two purposes in mind and my additional points, here's our agenda. In just a minute, we're going to do a quick little introduction poll, get a sense about who's here tonight attending the meeting. And then we'll receive a presentation from the consultants, from John and Sarah. And then we'll open it up for questions and comments. Tonight's participation for you all attendees is the introduction poll, and we'll have the live results there. In addition, you have on your Zoom, you see the Q&A function down below, and that's where we're going to ask you to submit questions via the Zoom Q&A function. We are not enabling the chat or the unmute options here this evening. We will take the questions that you present here and type into the Q&A. And in addition to that, we have received many questions in advance, and we've organized those, and we're going to be able to answer those questions. And in addition to that, there are frequently asked questions that have come up over the last couple weeks or months. And John and Sarah will actually walk through some of those questions. We put those on slides. So lots of opportunities for questions here this evening. As I mentioned earlier, there's a next steps specifically around the general plan and how the city is moving forward on that. And there's an opportunity there for public comment with city council meeting related to the general plan as that relates to historic designation. We will end the meeting formally at 8 p.m. this evening, and there will be an open house afterwards. If some of you want to stay around, John, Sarah, the consultants, the technical consultants, and staff are happy to answer any additional questions at the open house following the meeting, but that's totally optional. Okay, we're ready to move forward here, and let's get into the introduction poll. There are 4 questions. One is, are you a San Mateo resident? The second is, are you a homeowner or renter? You can just go ahead and type in your response. And the third question asks neighborhood. What neighborhood do you live in? There are lots of options here. San Mateo has lots of neighborhoods, so find your neighborhood in there. And then don't forget the fourth question after the neighborhood, and that's the ask for your level of knowledge and familiarity with historic resources, historic processes, designation, and preservation. So we'll just leave the poll open for a couple minutes as you type in your responses. And I should also mention, this poll is anonymous and there's no expectations here, especially on the fourth question about familiarity and knowledge. There's no prerequisite for the meeting. Everybody's welcome, and it doesn't matter what your level of knowledge or familiarity is. Okay, Jen, what do you think? Are we ready to
Yeah, I
discuss
think
the
so.
results?
I'll go ahead and end the poll and share results here.
Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see the poll results here. We have a vast majority of participants are San Mateo residents, 93% you can see, 7% who live outside, reside outside of San Mateo. Are you a homeowner or renter? 88% are homeowners and 12% are renters. Very good. We can scroll down. We have a couple, looks like one person from 19th Avenue Park. Aragon has 6. Baywood has 43%, likely to be the top neighborhood. Beresfield, Hillsdale, we have 4 people. There's 1 from Boreal, 3 from Central, 1 from downtown. Very nice. A nice mix here from all across the city. Eastern Addition, we have a person. Hayward Park, Hillsdale, a couple people there. That's great. Los Prados, 1 from there, and 6 people from North Central. San Mateo, Glendale Village, we have a person. San Mateo Park, 3 from there. Sunny Bray, Westwood Knolls, Woodland, Wood Lake. Unsure. Sometimes you're unsure about what your neighborhood is. And I will say I put together this list of neighborhoods, and there are a lot of neighborhoods listed. If your neighborhood is not listed, which one do you live in? So there was 14 people, 21% answered there in terms of identifying their neighborhood. And we weren't able to capture all the neighborhoods exclusively. So appreciate typing in your neighborhood there. Okay, in terms of our last question, how familiar or knowledgeable are you about San Mateo's historic resources and districts? 22% are very familiar and knowledgeable. The majority, somewhat familiar and knowledgeable, and 26% not very familiar or knowledgeable. So that's very helpful for us as we go through the presentation and we go through the question and answers. Our consultants and staff will be able to hopefully adapt the information and the answers to the questions based on what we're seeing there in terms of familiarity and knowledge. Very good. Thank you very much for the poll results. At this point, then, get a sense of who's here, what neighborhoods, level of familiarity and knowledge. We are ready to move forward onto the presentation. And I'm going to turn it over to John Rush and Sarah Hahn, who you met earlier, and they're going to walk us through the presentation. John, I think you're up.
I'm up.
I'm sorry, Sarah.
Thanks, Sean.
Sarah
That's
is
okay.
up.
Thanks, Sean. And good evening, everyone. We're going to start with a presentation, just a brief overview of some of the content that we've been helping the city develop for their website. So I'll start out the presentation and then hand it over to my colleague, John Rush. First slide is what are historic resources. Historic resources are buildings, structures, objects, sites, landscapes, or a grouping of these properties known as a district that are historically significant in history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, or culture. These are usually more than 50 years old and qualify for listing in a local, state, or national historic register. And properties can be both formally listed in these registers and can also be found eligible without going through the formal listing process. Next slide. Historic districts are significant groupings of buildings, structures, or objects that share a significant historic context, plan, and or aesthetic. They can contain individually significant properties, contributing properties, and non-contributing properties. Individually eligible or listed properties are significant in their own right. Contributors are properties that date to the district's period of significance and retain sufficient integrity to convey that significance. And non-contributors don't convey the district's significance, possibly because they were built outside of the period of significance or have been altered to the point where they can no longer convey the characteristics for which the district is significant. Next slide. So what is the process for listing a historic resource? Properties can be listed in the National Register of Historic Places at the federal level, the California Register of Historical Resources at the state level, or in local historic registers or inventories. The National Register is managed by the National Park Service in coordination with state governments. The California Register is managed by the California Office of Historic Preservation, known as OHP, or sometimes referred to as SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office. Local registers are managed by individual municipalities. Both the National and California registers share similar criteria for evaluation of historic resources, focusing on identifying significance for association with events, people, architectural design and construction. Archaeological resources can also be significant for the information that they may provide to on history or prehistory. Local registers often have similar criteria for listing. So nominating a property to either the National or California registers requires review and approval by OHP or the SHPO and the State Historical Resources Commission. National Register nominations are also require review by the National Park Service. For a property to be listed in the California Register, nomination materials are submitted to the local government for comment and to OHP for staff review. OHP then notifies property owner or owners and reviews the application to make sure it's complete. And the nomination process for the National Register is similar to the process for California Register. In California, OHP reviews completed National Register nomination and notifies property owners before it is heard by the State Historical Resources Commission. So a property cannot be formally listed in either the California Register or the National Register over owner opposition. And in the case of historic districts, a district cannot be listed if a majority of property owners oppose the designation. During the nomination process, OHP will send letters to property owners to notify them of the pending nomination. And if more than 50% of property owners document their opposition to the historic district's designation in writing, then the State Historic Resources Commission will not approve the nomination. So even if the historic district isn't formally listed in the California or National Registers due to objections by property owners, the commission may still determine the district to be eligible for listing based on the information in the nomination. Eligible districts don't qualify for certain preservation incentives, such as the federal or state tax credits, but these eligible districts are treated the same as listed districts during state and federal level project review, including under the California Environmental Quality Act. So what resources or what incentives are available for historic resources? We have a few listed here. The Mills Act program is administered by local governments, and provides property tax relief to owners of qualifying historic resources. In San Mateo, under their process, owners of National Register listed and eligible resources can choose to sign a contract with the city. And in exchange for maintaining and preserving their historic property, the owner receives a property tax reduction. At the federal level, the National Park Service and the IRS administer the federal Historic Preservation Tax Incentives Program, which offers a tax credit for rehabilitation projects that follow the Secretary's standards, which we'll get to a little bit later in this presentation. The program applies only to National Register listed properties, including historic district contributors that generate income. So owner-occupied residences aren't eligible for this tax credit. The state of California has also funded the state historic rehabilitation credit. There's 50 million of funding in that program, but details are currently in development for that program, but it is expected to launch this year. Construction and remodeling projects for historic resources can also use the California Historical Building Code. This is a code that allows some flexibility that's not otherwise available for new construction. It provides alternative building regulations for permitting repairs, alterations, and additions for qualified historic buildings. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, John Rush.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So next we want to discuss the different reviews that are often triggered for historic resources under local and state laws. So we'll start with the local review process in San Mateo. Under the current historic preservation ordinance, the city conducts its historic review process when a project is proposed for properties in one of three buckets. So the first would be the properties that are listed in or formally eligible for the California and national registers. 2, properties that were identified as significant in the Historic Resource Survey that occurred in 1989 in San Mateo. And then 3rd, any property that a professionally qualified architectural historian identifies as eligible for listing in a historic register. And that evaluation is included in a report called a Historic Resource Evaluation, or HRE, and would be required when a property hasn't been surveyed in the past. So when a project is proposed for a historic resource, the city's review process is required under the general plan and the zoning code. When that happens, city staff will review the proposed project design. If the project is in the downtown historic district, then that district has its own design guidelines that help project planning and allow for more streamlined review. Excuse me. All other projects are evaluated using the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, which are general best practices for preserving a property or making updates while also maintaining its historic character. And we'll discuss those in a little bit more detail in a minute. And then lastly, projects are also reviewed under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which is an additional layer of review on top of what the city's ordinance requires. So we'll look at each of these on the following slides. Here is the local review process broken down as a simple flow chart. The process is triggered when substantial exterior alterations are proposed for individual historic resources and contributors to the downtown historic district. Note that a project in the downtown historic district that meets the district design guidelines would not require planning application. All other projects proposed for historic resources require submittal of a planning application, which will require a meeting with city staff, as well as project plans and material samples that allow staff to assess the project and its potential impacts. Then the project review can proceed, and the city uses the Secretary of the Interior standards to determine how successful the project design is at preserving the historic character of a significant resource. So we've mentioned the Secretary of the Interior standards a couple times now, and they're an important tool that is used in the review process. So we want to look at these in more detail. The Secretary standards were developed by the National Park Service and are intended to offer general guidance for preservation and adaptive reuse projects. There are actually 4 closely related sets of standards for different treatment approaches, but the set of standards that we use most frequently are the standards for rehabilitation. By nature, these allow some flexibility in order to adapt or expand a building or to put it into new use. However, the standards won't tell you exactly what materials have to be used for a project or other fine-grained technical issues. Instead, they are broad, qualitative considerations. So this slide shows all 10 of the standards for rehabilitation, with several in bold that typically receive the most attention during review. At their core, the standards assess whether a property's key historic characteristics, materials, and spaces are preserved. And I want to stress that the standards do allow some change, but that change should be reviewed in the context of the property's overall historic character and whether that is still clear after the project is complete. So for instance, new additions are allowed, but they should have a scale that respects the original building, and they should be designed so that they can be identified as new rather than confused as original to the property. The last topic we want to dive into in more detail at this point in the meeting is CEQA, or the California Environmental Quality Act, which has its own review requirements for historic resources. The CEQA process is triggered by discretionary projects, usually more substantial alterations, and in San Mateo, these are the ones that are triggered by that require planning applications. CEQA applies to both listed and eligible historic resources, including historic districts. It wouldn't matter then if a majority of property owners in a proposed district has opposed it as its formal designation, if the district was found eligible by the State Historical Resources Commission, then it still needs to be considered under CEQA. The Secretary's standards are used in CEQA in addition to the local review process. Often, projects that are found to meet the standards can be exempted from the CEQA review. Projects that don't meet the standards, though, could require a more complex environmental review document that takes additional time and money to complete. Note, though, that interior renovations are typically not subject to CEQA review. So regarding historic districts in particular, CEQA would apply to multiple types of projects, including alterations or even demolitions of district contributors, new additions, and new construction on lots that contain non-contributing properties. So just because a project would make direct changes to only a non-contributor doesn't mean that CEQA isn't required. Because that property is located within a historic district, it still has the potential to affect the surrounding district's important characteristics, and that would be analyzed under CEQA. However, one more important point to make is that for historic districts, it's typically the district as a whole that impacts are assessed to rather than an individual contributor. So it's possible that one single project like an addition or even a demolition of a district contributor would not have a significant impact on the district as a whole, even though demolition of an individually eligible building would be considered significant under CEQA. So I want to pass it back to Sean for a moment to tee up our question and answer period.
Very good. So as I mentioned at the outset, type in your questions using the Q&A function. And I see that several of you have already done that, which is fantastic. You can do that throughout the course of the meeting here. As I also mentioned at the outset, staff has received questions over the last few weeks, over the last month or so, which falls into a frequently asked question category. And so we have those on slides, and we're going to go ahead and have John and Sarah walk through those slides with the frequently asked questions. While that's happening, go ahead and type in any new questions that you have, and again, using the Q&A feature. Let me also mention that you can see the webinar here is being recorded. So if you missed anything at the meeting, it will be posted on the city website, and you can go back and review them and review this meeting if you miss anything or need additional clarification. With that said, then we have about 5 or so frequently asked questions, so let's get into those. I own a historic resource in San Mateo. Can I still make changes to my property?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and one that we expect is at the front of mind for many people who own or live in properties identified as historic resources. And the answer is yes, changes are still possible. The goal of historic preservation is not to stop all change from happening, but instead to balance change with maintaining a property's historic character. So allowable changes can include regular maintenance and repair, replacing exterior materials, interior renovations, and additions. However, a project will move through the review process fastest if it is designed to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. But again, the standards for rehabilitation offer broad guidance and do not lay out specific treatment approaches. So there still needs to be the step where the standards are interpreted for a particular property and what makes it significant.
Are there added permits or costs associated with owning a historic resource or a property in a historic district?
Yeah, also a good question, and potentially there are some additional costs. A planning application would be required for certain projects in individually eligible properties and properties in the downtown historic district. Hiring a qualified architectural historian and or a historical architect will certainly help during the planning stages of your project in order to develop a design that meets the standards, but that would be potentially an additional cost. Additionally, the city's review process may require a report that formally analyzes the project using the Secretary's standards, which would inform either the local review process or CEQA review, and the property owner would be responsible for paying for that study. Historic resource status could also limit the types of products that are used in some cases. For instance, let's say a project proposes to replace a building's original wood sash windows. Vinyl windows, which are typically viewed as a more affordable option, may not meet the Secretary's standards, whereas other window types that would cost more potentially would meet the standards. But this really differs from resource to resource. And then finally, a general cost to consider is that historic resource status does put limits on the expansion or redevelopment potential of a particular property.
What is State Bill 9, actually Senate Bill 9, and how does it deal with historic resources?
Yeah, so California Senate Bill 9, also typically known as SB 9, is intended to promote housing development in areas zoned for single-family residences. Although the subdivision through the subdivision of one lot into two, in the construction of a second dwelling unit on the parcel. So under SB 9, these types of projects would not require CEQA review, also known as they would be eligible for ministerial review. One exemption, however, is that SB 9 does not apply to individual historic resources or to properties within the boundaries of identified historic districts.
Can I build an accessory dwelling unit, an ADU, on my property if it is a historic resource?
Yeah, so ADUs are increasingly popular as a way to develop new housing and could be either attached to an existing building or detached to the primary building. An ADU can still be constructed on a property that contains a historic resource if it is otherwise allowed. Review of the ADU design, though, would need to consider how well it meets the Secretary's standards, like any other project type. Particular issues that might need to be considered would be its placement on its lot, its scale and visibility, and whether construction of the ADU requires the removal of any of the resource's historically significant features.
When would an environmental review document be required for a project?
Yeah, so under CEQA, there are various types of documents that could be prepared when CEQA is triggered. These documents cover many different topics in the environment, but one of those is historic resources. And as we've mentioned, projects that comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards may qualify for an exemption from CEQA review. But generally speaking, a common type of environmental document that is produced for CEQA compliance is a mitigated negative declaration, an MND. CEQA loves its acronyms, of course, which could be appropriate in cases when a project has an impact, but mitigations are available to reduce that impact. For historic resources, an MND might be the document that is used in situations when a project is not compliant with the Secretary standards, but still doesn't demolish or very substantially alter the exterior of the resource. And then EIRs, or environmental impact reports, are the most complex documents produced for CEQA compliance, most often for large new development and planning projects. EIRs are required when a project causes a significant impact to the environment that cannot be mitigated, which for historic resources might mean the full demolition of a resource or substantial alterations to its exterior. So I think I would just want to pass it back to Sean. We'll move into the next phase of questions.
Very good. Thank you, John. So we are now ready to take on the participant questions. Hopefully, in those frequently asked questions, you saw some of the inquiries that match what you're asking about. And also, we're also hoping that in the presentation that John and Sarah gave, that you had some of your questions answered in that in the presentation. Now, of course, as mentioned, this is a complex topic. There's lots of different angles and layers to it. And I know there are lots of questions being asked in the Q&A, and they're great questions. Keep them coming. Staff has received several participant questions from participants prior to this meeting, and we have some of those, and then the questions that are being asked right here live in the Q&A. So let's get to those questions, and I will read them, and we'll have staff and the consultants answer those. Here's a question. Does San Mateo's historic and this is from a community member, does San Mateo's historic preservation ordinance automatically apply to new districts that are listed or determined to be eligible to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places or the California Register of Historical Resources? Or does the ordinance have to be updated each time a new district is listed or determined to be eligible?
And Sean, I'm happy to take that one if you like. So the city currently has a historic preservation ordinance, but if there are new districts that are designated under the National Register or the California Register, then it would be up to the city council whether they would like to amend the local ordinance to address those additional districts.
Very good. Thank you, Manira. Another question. Does San Mateo intend to create ordinances for historic preservation specific for each new district that is determined to be eligible, use the existing downtown ordinance, or create a new blanket ordinance?
That's also going to be me. So the city is currently in the process of updating its general plan. I know I was going to cover some of that in our next steps slide, but the general plan update that is scheduled for adoption hearings before the city council in March of this year does include a number of policies and action items for historic resource protections. And one of them is Action CD 5.8, which is related to updating the historic preservation ordinance to create a framework for the designation of historic resources and districts, establish review and permitting procedures for historic alterations, demolitions, or relocations to be consistent with federal and state standards and guidelines and align with the policies that are proposed in the general plan.
Very good. And you can see that these questions here, we've grouped them together under what we're calling city process questions, because both of those first two questions were really about city process. Here's another question. My house has been modified and is not historic. How do I opt out of the designation?
And I assume this means how do you opt out of a district designation process? And I'll turn it over to John to see if he can shed some light on that process with the state.
John?
John, are you able to address that?
Sorry, just on mute.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was also my interpretation of this question, is that it related to a property in a historic district or proposed historic district. And if it's been modified or potentially was built after the period of significance for that district, it may very well be identified as a non-contributor. However, if the district were to move forward and be either approved at the state level or formally determined eligible by the State Historical Resources Commission, the district that property is located in really becomes official in some way, at least in terms of the way that CEQA would look at it or how it would be treated for the CEQA review process. So there really isn't a process for opting out. That if a property is located within the boundary of a district, and that district moves through the review process, then it is likely to be subject to CEQA review, certainly in the future.
Very good. Thank you, John. We're still on city process focus questions. Would any city resources be required to administer a historic district?
I think it would really depend. So, for example, we already have a historic district in the city, the Downtown Historic District, and the city does not administer the district. I think we look at it from a project by project basis and determine if there is a project that is a contributor or an individually eligible resource in the downtown district, for example, and whether there would be any impact to that particular listed resource or eligible resource, or if changes to that property would have an impact on the downtown district itself. So I wouldn't say that we would administer any historic district. The only way we would be involved would be to look at the historic preservation ordinance, as I said. So if we create any kind of tools that look at historic preservation in that district, such as new design guidelines, then that would be something that the city would have to develop. And the process of developing that would require public input. It would probably need city council action. So there would be some effort that would go into establishing those guidelines for development within that district.
Okay, moving on, what will the budgetary impact be for the city in order to facilitate historical reviews?
Mhm. So when a project is proposed, an applicant has to file a planning application with the city. So it's, on a cost recovery basis, the planning application is charged the staff and material costs that are associated with processing that planning application. So individual projects would not affect the department or the city's budget.
And what would the appeals process be if a requested change to a historic resource was denied?
So typically staff works with applicants when a planning application is submitted to address issues. If there are red flags about a project, we try to work with the applicants and raise them early on in the process. So, so we can see if we can work together to make the project be compliant with the city's standards and requirements. However, should, a project be denied, whether it's at the staff level or at the planning commission level, that's because of its historic character or impacts to its historic nature, then those actions can be appealed to the city council. And then any action at the city council level can be appealed in the court of law.
Very good. Thank you, Manera. I do want to mention here that there are a lot of overlapping questions, obviously. And so we're not taking each one, we're putting the overlapping questions together. Also, some of the questions that have been asked in advance, as well as mostly the questions that have been asked in advance, were answered in the presentation part or in the frequently asked questions. So we don't need to go over those as well. But let's move on. We have another set of questions that relate to CEQA, as you heard earlier, California's Environmental Quality Act. So these are questions related to that. And we have one here. We understand eligible resources and districts are subject to restrictions set by federal and state law, CEQA. Can the city choose not to enforce CEQA or make those restrictions less stringent? Manera, do you want to handle that question?
Yes, and I may need John to weigh in as well, because I do think it'll be helpful to hear from him the protections under the federal and state requirements. However, for CEQA, which is the environmental review process, when a planning application is filed with the city, when it's a discretionary action that the city has to make findings on, those are subject to CEQA, and the city does not really have the ability to bypass that process or make that less stringent. We have to demonstrate it's the purpose of the environmental review is full disclosure to show the public if there is an impact or isn't an impact of the proposed project. So the city has to go through that whole process as the lead agency. But if the project is minor in nature, or if the project meets all of the Secretary of Interior standards, and I know John covered this earlier, a project can be exempt from the CEQA requirements. So I think it really is dependent on the type of project that is proposed in the context. John, do you want to add anything on the federal or state law?
Yeah, I think maybe the state law, I think that CEQA covers the state side of things. And for federal, there is a federal review process, but it does not come into play very often for, for private property owners. It's through the National Historic Preservation Act. And it really is only triggered when there's federal funding, federal permits, federal licensing, or federal land. So it's the sort of thing that you might run into if you were building a highway, but I would imagine that most people on this call aren't doing that sort of thing on a daily basis, that they would need to cover the process for. So generally that federal process, we didn't really touch on it because it doesn't come up very often, for private property owners.
Okay, staying with CEQA questions, and we've received several questions related to this one. What types of alterations to historical resources does San Mateo consider ministerial?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really, again, there are two types of project applications. So one is the ministerial projects that go straight to building permit. They don't require a planning application. And typically they're like minor roof replacements, definitely repair and maintenance projects, interior alterations to residences. They don't count, they are considered ministerial, and landscaping changes as well. There are, the projects that are discretionary, which is when a planning application is required, and those do require CEQA review.
Excellent, very good. Okay, those, at least for the questions that were submitted in advance, those are the CEQA questions. There's several technical questions that have been submitted by community members, and we'll get into those now. If a historical district were to be created, who would be the arbiter of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable for exterior visible changes to be made?
So we've mentioned the Secretary of the Interior standards, and so those are clearly it's been established at the federal level and are utilized, through their connections to state laws and utilized by municipalities across the country. Really, a city like San Mateo would work with a qualified consultant who's professionally qualified in architectural history to provide a review of the proposed work using the Secretary of the Interior standards. And that's pretty standard protocol for municipalities, complying with CEQA in California and also enacting their own local review process. So the local agency would review the proposed changes to, say, a historic district contributor or non-contributor to evaluate potential impacts under CEQA, working with potentially a consultant. And then I just wanted to mention as well that sometimes there's a misunderstanding that the Office of Historic Preservation, the state agency, gets closely involved in CEQA cases, but really OHP doesn't really have authority over local public agencies who are complying with CEQA. And it rarely chooses to comment on the CEQA compliance process for specific local projects. But it is possible as an informal process.
Very good. Thank you, John. Next question. What is the maximum amount of tax benefit, if at all, that people might enjoy if they own a historic resource?
I'm not aware of any maximum that has been identified. When Sarah spoke, she mentioned the state historic preservation tax credit, which is yet to be formally launched, has a funding cap, but the federal tax credit program, which is for income producing properties, and the Mills Act programs, they don't have maximums for the financial benefit that we're aware of.
Okay.
But it's also just want to mention that it's kind of difficult. Those areas, they get very technical on the accounting and tax side. So if a community member were really looking closely at those opportunities, they would probably want to consult an accountant or tax advisor.
Very good. Has anybody surveyed other cities' homeowners in a comprehensive manner to ask if they are experiencing any undue burden due to owning a historic resource? And I'll just answer that question. Staff is not aware of any survey that's been conducted. Next question, cumulative impact question. At what point does the balance tip? And John, if you could help interpret the question there. I know you know the answer to it, but for those of us who are less familiar, what's the question being asked here?
So the question is about a cumulative impact, which is something that is part of the CEQA analysis. So cumulative impact is something that maybe the project that's being analyzed is making a change to one particular property or one area of a historic resource, but then in the past, other projects have kind of made these incremental changes to the same resource or the same district. And so maybe that one project, when viewed in isolation, the level of change that it's making is fairly minor, but when viewed in the context of all these other projects that have also happened, maybe that resource is finally starting to lose its integrity. And so the question really, we know that, this comes up a lot, and it's a really, really great question, especially for historic districts, which is, when is there that tipping point when, maybe just theoretically enough buildings have been demolished or have their facades replaced or projects of that nature that, it's really not, doesn't hang together anymore as a district the way that it did when it was first designated. And I wish that I had a simple answer and a simple guidance on this, but it really depends on the size and the character of what that district is and what its contributors are. And kind of the way that the continuity in a district or the linkages in a district exist just can vary from case to case. So, there might be some small project, or sorry, a small district where one or two projects might meet that tipping point of having, compromising the sense of continuity throughout the district. But with a large district, it may require, quite a few more projects to have the same kind of degree of change to the entire district.
Very good. That was helpful. Thank you. Here's another question. Is a traditional vote where unreturned ballots are not counted as yes votes and the results of the vote have a practical effect on the outcome part of the state's process?
Yeah, and so this question is about the process for for owners to approve or oppose the designation of a historic district. So we just want to be provide a little bit more detail on that process. So it could be thought of as a vote, but once a district designation moves to the point of being reviewed by the Office of Historic Preservation and stands to be then forwarded to the State Historical Resources Commission for their review and potential approval, then the property owners are notified of that pending nomination. So they would have the opportunity to express their opposition, and there's a particular type of letter or documentation that would need to be presented to the State Historic Preservation Office, or OHP. And so 50%, at least 50% of the property owners in a district would need to provide that level of documentation. So it would be like a short letter stating opposition to the designation. Either they can be notarized, or you would state on it that that statement is being made under the penalty of perjury. And then each owner in the historic district has one vote, regardless of whether they own more than one property. So that's the way that kind of vote scenario would play out. But if, again, just reiterating what we've mentioned previously, that if more than 50% of the property owners in that district do express that opposition, then the district would not be formally listed, but still, it may still be determined to be eligible.
Very good. Here's another question. It's been asked by several community members, and we've touched on it a little bit in the presentation, but we'll unpack it a little bit more here. What restrictions are placed on historic resources by federal and state laws and local regulations?
Yeah, and we think we've mentioned that there are these overlapping regulatory environments, and so some at the federal, although those don't apply very often, CEQA at the state level, and then the local review process. So just to reiterate, the local review process covers some individual resources that were identified as significant in the 1989 survey, and then National Register listed properties, as well as additional properties that might have been identified through those kind of ad hoc historic resource evaluation reports. But then CEQA goes a bit further in its purview and would apply to all to any district that would be that may have been found eligible through that designation process. But even if it's not formally listed, that eligibility would mean that it's considered under CEQA. And then I think the comment was on restrictions, and so I just want to, I think, clarify that it's not, CEQA isn't necessarily stating restrictions. It is stating an additional review process, and maybe that's a review process that would be, not easy. It's not time. It would be time consuming and potentially expensive to go through in some cases. So maybe that would restrict a process, or I'm sorry, restrict a project. But CEQA does lay out a process then to move through, for project review and ultimate approval.
Very good. Who determines if a proposed change to a historical resource is, quote, substantial and adverse, end of quote, and if a proposed mitigation is sufficient?
And so that relates to the CEQA process, and the city is the lead agency for CEQA, and may make these determinations with the input of qualified historic preservation professionals and substantial evidence in the record. So yeah, so they may work with the preservation professionals to develop the analysis that would be the evidence for that determination.
Here's a multiple part question. Baywood comprises 42 different architectural styles. If a house is contributing, will it need to stay in the same style, or could local ordinances be written such that a demolition rebuild simply needs to stay within the character of the neighborhood? In other words, could a Mediterranean be changed to a ranch style, since we have both types currently?
Yeah, and so I can't speak to the Baywood kind of nature of this question specifically, but I think that just more broadly for historic districts, yeah, there might be some districts where different architectural styles are represented. But I would think that if you have a property where you're removing the original historic materials and replacing them with materials that might reflect a different style, that project may not be found to comply with the standards, because it would remove original historic fabric, and then also potentially would create a false sense of historical development. And both of those are issues that are covered in the standards.
Very good. Another question. I do not want my home to be included in the historic district. How do I get an exemption?
Okay, yeah, and I think that we touched on this for a previous comment, but there really is not a process for removing your property from consideration if it's been identified as within the boundaries of a district. But there is the process for property owners having the ability to oppose the nomination.
How are my property rights being limited once the historical district is established? Am I ever allowed to tear down a house and build something new?
Yeah, so I would say that in a historic district, demolition of a district contributor or even a non-contributor is often allowed. I mean, say under CEQA, that process would be allowed, but may require an environmental review document and that review process to determine the impact to the historic district, and then disclose that impact, and then works through that the CEQA process, which of course may take time in some cases.
What is the local alternative in lieu to state national registry? Can local ordinances serve to enforce district coherence?
So I think the answer to one good way to answer this question is that a lot of municipalities do have processes for designating historic districts in a local register. San Mateo currently does not, beyond the downtown historic district. But it's possible that a local historic preservation ordinance could be drafted with any range of provisions that are different from, say, a standard historic district review process. I'm thinking of, there's a concept of conservation districts, which are kind of seen as like historic district lights or historic districts, but maybe the community would have the ability to kind of craft the review process so that it's it doesn't get into quite as fine-grained details maybe sometimes like a traditional historic district review process would get.
Very good. When will the residential objective design standards be ready for review? Will they include historic properties?
I'm wondering, this might be a question for somebody from the city to answer.
I can take this one on, John. Thank you. So yes, objective design standards for residential residential multifamily projects and mixed use projects have already been adopted by council. That was this last November. And they apply to mixed use and multifamily projects that are more than 2/3 residential. So if a project is a historic resource, or if a project that is subject to objective design standards is a historic resource, then any changes would also have to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. So it would be subject to both, but yeah, the objective design standards are already adopted.
Very good. Thank you, John and Manera. We are ready to move forward with live questions that are being asked here during the meeting. As I noted, the questions that we just answered were submitted in advance. And hopefully your questions that you've asked, you're seeing them being addressed here by other questions that your community members have asked, as well as the presentation. Let's move on. What constitutes a significant enough change to not be historic? Manera, you want to take the first shot at this one?
Yes, I would be happy to, Sean. And I do want to clarify, when I was responding to the objective design standards, those are for multifamily projects. So we do not currently have objective design standards for single family residences, if, the question was more interested in those kinds of projects.
Very good.
Yes, so moving on to what constitutes a significant enough change to not be historic. So typically the criteria is where an existing house or a potential resource in the past has been modified to the extent that it doesn't retain the original integrity and character defining features. And, the property can no longer convey its historical significance. At that point, it would no longer be historic.
Anything to add, John?
No, I think that was a really nice, succinct answer.
Excellent. Very good. Another question, can you give examples of what type of exterior alterations would be an issue? Changing windows, changing roof lines, adding rooms that are visible from the street? I know this was touched on in the presentation. John, you want to reiterate what you had shared, or Sarah?
Yeah, I think that just reading the question once more. So, I mean, any of these could potentially be issues depending on the resource and depending on the type of change that's being proposed. But I also want to say that all of these could be accomplished while also meeting the Secretary of the Interior standards. So that certainly, the project planning can be a really important piece. I guess that changing roof lines might be more of a, that kind of suggests more of a change in the general form of the building, and that, of these that were mentioned, that might be the one that could have the greatest likelihood of being an issue. I mean, adding additions has the potential as well, but I don't think that simply being visible from the street as kind of a ground rule means that it is not, a good project. I think that it really depends on some nuances of the site and the project design. So it does depend, and but I think that if you look closely at the standards, they do provide really good guidance on, what sort of considerations should be in mind.
Excellent. Okay, historic requirements are in addition to the necessity to meet code requirements. Please confirm.
Generally, yes. So historic review criteria, such as, checking against the Secretary of Interior standards, the Historic Preservation Ordinance, as well as the design guidelines, can apply on top of other code requirements, which could be your standard like height and setback and land use standards.
Very good. Moving forward here, there was a point about avoiding abrasive physical treatments. What does that mean?
And that was standard number 7 of
Yes.
the standards for rehabilitation. And so those abrasive physical treatments, I mean, the one that we really often hear about is like sandblasting. So if there's a resource with, say, a brick exterior that would almost certainly be damaged during a sandblasting treatment, that's the sort of abrasive treatment that standard number 7 would certainly dissuade you from doing. There might be some very abrasive chemical treatments that would, that could actually like eat away at the historic fabric. And so those sort of treatments that would actually cause like a permanent physical damage.
Very good. When will a citywide reconnaissance study or survey be done to understand where historic resources and districts are located in San Mateo? We don't have a current inventory of historic resources, as the 1989 survey did not include the whole city.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that, Sean. I think it's to be determined when a survey would be done. I will say that we have an action item in the general plan update that's going before council in March that includes an action CD 5.10 for doing a historic resources survey, which speaks to establishing and maintaining an inventory of architecturally, culturally, and historically significant buildings, structures, sites, and districts. Proactively maintaining an up-to-date historic resources inventory by seeking funding opportunities, and preparing neighborhood-specific historic context statements prior to updating the historic resources survey. So we do have some action items, but we currently do not have a timeline.
Okay. A related question, the historic ordinance says it only applies to downtown and Glazenwood. Are you saying these requirements would apply to Baywood?
The current ordinance only applies to downtown historic district, and the ordinance would need to be amended if it were to apply to Baywood or a future district. I mean, it's speculative to say what would happen with the Baywood district. So I think it'll be up to the city council to determine how the ordinance is amended.
Very good. Are there historic Sanborn maps dating from 1930 or before for San Mateo that can be reviewed by city staff and the consultants? What can we citizens do to support a citywide pre-1930 inventory being conducted now? Similar question to the reconnaissance or survey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do have documentation. We have Sanborn maps that are available to review at the city's public counter. And John, I noticed you wanted to add a response as well. Like we have libraries that have some services as well that may be available.
Yeah, and actually, just to clarify what a Sanborn map is, I think that could be useful if people in attendance aren't familiar with that. But those were sets of maps that were produced by a company working in late 19th and early 20th century for decades, and they were mapping cities for fire insurance purposes, but they're really excellent records of the landscape of cities across the country. And some libraries have subscriptions to a service that's called Digital Sanborn Maps. So I myself have used that service to get San Mateo maps, and they're available going back into the 1890s or potentially even earlier. And so all it would require to access those is a library card at one of the subscribing libraries, but I'm not quite sure if the San Mateo County libraries do have a subscription.
Good. So there's a question here about the city's plans for 2024 to further historic preservation in San Mateo, and we will address that question, as I mentioned earlier, in the next steps that'll be coming up later in the meeting, and this relates to the general plan update. So we will answer that question when we come to that point in the meeting. Another question, this neighborhood, Baywood, should be designated as a historic resource to preserve how it was meant to be. Are there other neighborhoods in San Mateo nominated for this designation? And I'll just quickly answer that question. Staff at this point is only aware of the Baywood neighborhood nomination, which, as you know, was submitted by a private citizens group, and the city is not a party to that nomination, that application. What happens to a building permit for a house over 50 years old? How does the city consider historical significance when evaluating permits?
Yeah, I can reiterate some of what was covered already, Sean, that, a building permit could require a planning application, or, a project that is proposing modifying a house over 50 years old, for example, would require a planning application if it removes more than 50% of the existing walls. And, that triggers a discretionary review, a planning application, which then requires environmental review as well as a historic evaluation. If it is just a building permit that does not trigger the planning application, then those would be considered ministerial, and they're not subject to any extra review, and the project would be exempt from CEQA.
Very good. Can a lot split be done under normal city process if it is on the edge of a historic district?
I think this is being asked in the context of the Senate Bill 9 that we had covered in the frequently asked questions that allows for lot splits on single-family zoned areas of the city. And I think it depends the edge of a historic district. If it's just outside the historic district boundary, then, it can still avail itself of SB 9 and request a lot split. But if it is within a historic district, then it would not be eligible for SB 9.
Very good. If my house is located in the proposed Baywood Historic District and has been determined to be a contributor, wouldn't I be exempt from some of the paperwork needed to initiate the permit process?
I think generally speaking, if a project is located within a district, it would really depend on the regulations that apply to that project, the nature of the project. As we said earlier, if projects propose minor changes and are compliant with the Secretary of Interior standards, then they may not need additional review. So it really depends on the type of project that is proposed. And it can vary, like the extent of environmental review can vary. If it's a full demolition, then, the threshold may be higher on what kind of permit process or review process it requires.
Very good. How is the period of significance determined?
John, do you
So that's
want
probably, yeah. So it is, that determination or finding is made at the time of evaluation. So that's typically done by a qualified historic preservation professional, a preservation planner, architectural historian. And so it varies by what the significance of that resource is. In the case of an archaeological property, a period of significance might be thousands of years. More, when we're talking about the built environment or building structures districts, it's more typical that the period of significance might be, say, a few years or a decade, or maybe even 1 year. Like if architecturally significant building is found to meet the eligibility requirements, it's pretty typical for that to be the year of construction. If there was a significant event that happened, say a significant group of neighborhood or community members who are meeting in a particular location over, say, 5 years, the period of significance might relate to that period. So it's all dependent on the reason for that resource being significant.
Very good. Who determines whether a house is a contributor or non-contributor to a historic district? Is there any recourse if a homeowner disagrees with the assessment?
Yeah, so again, this is the determination that's made by the qualified historic preservation professional, who's experienced in making these types of determinations. For the National and California Register nominations, I don't know that I've ever seen a case where an individual homeowner in a district has actually brought a disagreement. Beyond that opposition process that's established in the designation kind of flow. So, in rare instances where a homeowner disagrees with that assessment, then looks like the homeowner could engage their own historian for a peer review.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to, we have a question queue here. I'm going to jump ahead. Does the city have a list of contributing houses? If so, where can we find a copy of the list? If not, will the city conduct a survey to determine which properties are contributing? Manira, would you
Yes.
like to answer that one?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So the city has a list of contributors in the Downtown Historic District and the Glazenwood Historic District. So these were covered in the city's 1989 historic survey, and as well as the downtown area plan.
Very good. I'm going to jump up here. What is the process for expanding any historic district and annexing more properties outside the district? Would the new area be considered a new district or an annex?
So I think this question is about amending an existing district. And so if that district is listed in the National Register or the California Register, then there is a process where you can actually submit amended documentation, and then you wind up going through, very similar process is as to when that district was first identified. So it goes to the State Office of Historic Preservation, and then it will be taken to the State Historical Resources Commission for their review. I think that it's possible that there are two districts that have their own reasons for significance that are immediately adjacent to one another. And in those cases, if the historical information supports that they have different enough areas of significance, then it would make sense to have two separate but adjoining historic districts.
If a neighborhood is designated historic, are there any new regulations that go into place with the designation? Or would the city have to revise ordinances in order for the new regulations to take effect?
So if a neighborhood is designated historic at the state or federal level, the city can choose to amend the ordinance. I think it'll be up to the city council to make that determination, whether any local guidelines or requirements have to be put into place. Or the city can rely on the Secretary of Interior Standards and the environmental review process for preservation of that district.
Good. Is there any local government action needed to start the process with the state to designate property in the city as a historical district? And I'll just go ahead and answer that. I think I referred to that in my opening comments. The answer is no. The nomination is submitted directly to the state for review. So again, the city is not involved in the nomination or application. Okay. Let me check in with staff on other questions that to address here.
I see a follow-up question, Sean, about the residential objective design standards. So I'm happy to speak to that. The question, do you want to read the question or I can read it?
Go ahead and read the question.
So the question says, when will the residential objective design standards be ready for review? And will they include historical properties and contributors? So I do know that in our historic policies and actions in the general plan update, we do have an action that's tied to developing objective design standards, including for contributors. However, the question of when is, not yet determined. We have not yet identified when that action would be implemented. We have many actions in the general plan. I think Zach would have the full list, but we have like a lot of different priorities that the city is juggling. So I'm not sure when we will get to that specific action.
Very good. Okay, other questions, staff? For me to read? Okay, I'm going to read a couple other questions here related to what we just heard from Manira, and that is one question is that downtown already has historic designation, and the general plan is proposing building tall buildings within downtown. And how is this aligning itself? And the answer there is the general plan update, the 2040 general plan update, isn't proposing new tall buildings, rather it is being amended to allow buildings of a certain height. So that answers that question. I'm looking here.
Sean,
Go ahead.
a little supplemental to that, and Zach Dahl with the Community Development Department. The general plan does propose land uses that look at some increased heights and densities around downtown, but that is outside of the downtown historic district. It's important to differentiate that a portion of downtown is within the downtown historic district, but most of the downtown, the larger downtown area, is actually not within that district. And so that potential increase in height and density is located primarily there, but densities and heights were actually kept lower within the downtown district itself as part of the general plan, which is going to be going forward to council for consideration for adoption in March, but has not been adopted as of yet.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification, Zach. I do want to answer a question that was asked about the slides being available. And as I had mentioned, this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on the city website. So you'll have access to this meeting, and you can read the slides, obviously, that John and Sarah presented will be available. So you'll have that and you can view that at your own pace, at your own time, and you'll have those slides available, as well as the Q&A piece and every other part of the meeting here. Okay, I'm looking at another question here. Wouldn't most residential projects within historical districts not trigger an environmental impact report?
I would say that's probably a fair statement that, most residential projects within historical districts may not trigger an environmental report, but it'll really depend on the extent of the changes that each of those projects is proposing to their property and whether or not it meets the Secretary of Interior standards. I think the environmental impact report, which is the highest level of review under the California Environmental Quality Act, gets triggered when there is a potential significant impact to an eligible historic resource or historic district. And as John pointed out earlier, like it really depends on the extent of the project.
Okay, very good. I'm going to jump up and there was asking for clarification on one of the earlier questions on the no vote on the historic district. And I just want to clarify here that when John answered that question, he was referring to the language in the question that was presented. The National Register of Historic Places Bulletin, How to Support or Object to a Listing, does mention the word vote too, but it is correct that you can formally object to listing, whether or not it's called a vote or not, but you can formally object to a listing. Just want to clarify that. Okay, we're moving forward with some other questions here. Let me get myself organized. Okay. Would the city of San Mateo consider creating a historic resources advisory committee similar to what Redwood City and many other peninsula cities have?
I can speak to that, Sean. Sorry, I was reading the questions. They're coming in fast and furious, aren't they?
Yes,
Which we
yes.
really appreciate. It's keeping us on our toes, and I hope we are providing the information that you're looking for. So at this point, the city has not identified that we would be creating a historic resources advisory committee. I think when the process of updating the historic resources ordinance start, I think at that point, the staff will be evaluating all options and presenting to council on possible paths forward. But at this point, there is no plan to create create a committee like that.
Okay, very good. I do see a question in the Q&A, resubmitting my question. When was the application, the Baywood application nominations sent to the state? When will the residents of Baywood get their letters from the state? Those questions, the city does not have answers to those questions. Again, they're not a party to the nomination, to the application, and you can direct those questions to the San Mateo Historical Allegiance. Another question here. This is a very complete and professional discussion. Thank you. However, I have not heard how the public can participate in the process of drafting the pending historic language in the general plan. Or is it too late? It is not too late, and we will have a next step slide here shortly that outlines how you can participate in the general plan process. And there is an opportunity, a couple opportunities to do that next month.
And Sean, if I could just make a quick correction. So the applicant for the Baywood district with the state is the San Mateo Heritage Alliance.
I'm sorry.
So
I'm sorry.
yeah, no worries. So if people are interested to learn more about that application, please feel free to reach out to them directly. The city is not a party to that effort. You can also probably reach out to the state because the application has been submitted to the Office of Historic Preservation. So you can also direct your questions to them.
Very good. Okay. Other questions here? Yeah. So and a question about obtaining a copy of the nomination that Manera just answered. So we're looking at other questions here. Okay, I think we have gone through most of the questions that were asked. And if anybody has any additional questions, and I know there have been some comments that have been made as well, which is fine. We're obviously there's no answer to those, but we're happy to receive those comments.
And Sean, if I could add one more thing, I know there was a question about the budgeting and, what's the city's efforts on this topic. And I do want to say, so there, like earlier, I described what the city's process is when there's a planning application, and any consultants we bring on board is, of course, charged to that planning application and that project. However, the cities, and most cities have that, there is a budget for advanced planning projects and looking at community outreach. And so, our current consultants, which is ARG, those are, as well as Sean and Jen here, those come from that budget.
Okay. I have a question here. HREs currently only evaluate for individual significance. Does the city intend to revise this to include contributors to eligible historic districts and/or potentially eligible historic districts? Well, let's give staff a minute. That's a question just submitted. Let's give staff a minute to formulate their response.
Yeah, I can speak to that, Sean. So the city only looks at HREs when they are associated with like individually eligible properties. And of course, if they're within a designated district, the city does not put the burden of evaluating like full district evaluations on one contributor property. So we only look for individually eligible historic resources.
Yeah, very good. Okay. Let's unless there are, and let me just give staff a minute. We're processing all the questions coming in. We give staff just a minute to get organized. And not seeing any. I think we've covered most of the questions, and the HRE question was just answered. Okay.
And Sean, there's one more question about the Office of Historic Preservation, if you want to read that out.
Okay, yes, let me ask that. The Office of Historical, has an Office of Historical Preservation ever disapproved a historic district such that it is non-eligible, thus not considered under CEQA? What factors do they consider to make this decision?
I'm not aware of any particular case, but it's certainly possible that a nomination has been provided to OHP. I mean, we have the National Register and the California Register eligibility criteria. So the significant associations with events, with people, with architecture, design and construction, and then information potential, typically archaeological. So once it goes to OHP, they're really looking at it closely against those criteria. And I mean, it is certainly possible that they have, said that we don't think that this district hangs together as much as it should. Potentially they might feel like there are too many contributors within that, or sorry, too many non-contributors when compared against the number of contributors in the district. But this is all kind of theoretical that I'm, could be part of a discussion that they would have when they're reviewing a nomination. I mean, they could say, oh, this is just a grouping of scattered buildings in, there's no historic context that we're able to really tie these into, apart from them being, just built over the course of 30 years, that doesn't really seem like it's a significant enough of a development pattern. Yeah, but I don't know of a particular example when that has been the outcome, when they have said that they, when actually the nomination has not moved on to the Resources Commission, but it is possible.
Okay, very good. Another question here. The word contributors is being dropped from the 2040 general plan. Why? Why is it dropped?
So I
Sean,
can,
yeah, go ahead, Zach.
sorry, Mira, I can provide a clarification to that. So the language in the 2040 general plan is aligned with the city's existing 2030 general plan, in that general plan 2030 has one policy that references contributors, and it's specific to contributors within the downtown historic district. And the general plan 2040 continues to maintain that same protection. The definition of historic resources in the general plan's glossary continues to reference contributors to the downtown historic district, and actually includes a reference to contributors in the Glazenwood historic district. The only other reference to contributors in general plan 2030 is within the text. And so text provides context, but it doesn't necessarily establish policy. And so as we've gone through the process, we actually have looked at the position that general plan 2040 is consistent with what general plan 2030 does. However, the final version of the text for the policies and actions in general plan 2040 are ultimately up to the city council when they consider adoption of the general.
Very good. Thank you, Zach. There's a question about where do we send our comments on the draft language in the general plan's historic resources elements? What is the deadline for comments? And we'll address that in the next steps when we do talk about the city's process for the general plan update. Okay, if a district is eligible but not listed, is it still eligible for benefits, Mills Act, state law exemptions? John, do you have can you address that one? If a district is eligible but not listed, is it still eligible for benefits?
Yeah, so I think that we might have mentioned this when we first introduced the incentives, but they not being fully listed on the National Register or California Register does limit what incentives that you're eligible for or qualify for. So it is you may not be eligible for the same incentives, but having the eligibility does mean that you do qualify still as a resource for the regulatory review like CEQA. So that's kind of the situation with the eligibility.
Very good,
And,
thank you.
and John, if I could ask a follow-up. So it doesn't qualify for the tax rebates, right? Like that's something you have to be a designated resource. Sorry if I missed that.
Yeah, with we don't fully know the details of the state tax credit yet. With the federal tax credit, you can start the process and there's a process that you actually work with the State Historic Preservation Office to kind of determine that your property is eligible, and then by the end of the process, you need to actually formally have your property listed in the National Register to qualify for that tax credit.
Okay, and then for local requirements, like that will dictate the eligibility for the Mills Act contract. And if you're locally listed, then that may mean that you can enter into a contract with the city and avail yourself of tax benefits at the local level.
Okay, John, I have a question here. If the law is changed such that Senate Bill 9 totally overpowers CEQA, will the rest of the historical commitments still exist?
So I might need some additional clarification on that question. I think I'm not grasping the sort of scenario that it's posing.
Yeah, so Senate Bill 9, if the law is changed that Senate Bill 9 supersedes CEQA, will the rest of the historical commitments still exist?
So that mean like for the local review process?
Yeah, yes.
I think it's probably, I don't know that we can answer that question because there's a lot of hypotheticals there.
Yeah.
We would need to see what type of the wording of the legislation, what its intent was, and it would probably provide some clarifications if it was going to take a step.
Yeah, very good. It does make an assumption there. I'm going to go on to another question here. If a district is eligible but not listed, is it still eligible for benefits, the Mills Act, state law exemptions?
Sean, I think we covered that, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay,
Mhm.
yes. Okay, I'm going to suggest that we move forward on to next steps.
Mhm.
And then if we have additional questions, participants, please go ahead and type those in. So Manira, please handle the next steps.
Yes, thank you, Sean. So I did want to go briefly over city actions and next steps on this topic. I know we've probably covered some of that already in the questions and answers, but I'm excited to share that we have an updated historic resources website available at the link on this page, and we're happy to put it also. We'll be posting this presentation up on that website as well, and it has a number of frequently asked questions on that website as well, specifically related to districts. So we encourage you to look at the resources that are on this website. And then I know we spoke a lot about the general plan update. I don't know how many folks who are present tonight have been actively engaged in the general plan process, but the general plan is the city's vision for the next for development in other areas that happen in the city in the next 20 years. And so it does include a community design and historic resources element in the general plan that has specific policies and actions for historic preservation. And specifically, we have, the key actions listed about updating the historic ordinance and also developing a citywide context statement. I also shared that, the actions also envision at some point conducting historic resources survey, including or exploring some other preservation incentives, developing historic resources design standards that are objective in nature, and then also exploring the feasibility of becoming a certified local government to become eligible for federal grant funds and technical assistance that further support historic preservation efforts. So those are some of the actions that will be considered by the council in the upcoming meetings in March. So we have two public hearings scheduled for this general plan adoption. It's on March 4th and March 18th. The general plan document itself is out for public review and comment. It's available at the strivesanmateo.org webpage. So you're welcome to look at these policies and actions in the general plan and provide comments directly to us, any of the planning staff that are present here tonight, or to the city council. And those will be taken into account and considered by the city council as part of their action.
Very good.
That's it from me, Sean. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, let me ask, are there any questions about city actions and next steps? Any questions about what the city is doing, planning to do, and how you can participate, especially in those council meetings in March related to the general plan? You can go ahead and just type in your questions if you have any questions about next steps and city actions. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions about next steps. Okay, I think we should, we can move towards closing out the meeting here. Unless I'm gonna just leave it open for just another minute here on Q&A. Okay, so next steps, do plan on participating in the council meetings related to the general plan. And do access the website that Manera just shared that has been updated. And there's frequently asked questions, and we'll continue to and staff will continue to update the website. And again, this meeting will be included. The recording of this meeting will be included on the website, and you'll have access to the slides and to the questions and answers. With that said, then we're going to close out the formal part of the meeting. And if anybody wants to stay, any staff will stay if you have want to engage with them in any other question and answer format. Okay, thank you, everybody, and I look forward to seeing how this process unfolds. And again, if anybody wants to stay for the open house, please stay on the webinar. Thank you and have a good evening. Okay. Okay, I'm looking at some other questions here. We still have several of you who are still here, so let's continue on. Okay. Okay, let me ask,
Oh,
yes, go ahead,
sorry,
Manera.
Sean. Yeah, I was going to say, I think we have a couple of questions from one of the members of the public, Lisa Vandervoort, and she's staying on, so maybe we can speak to those.
Yes, okay. The two questions above,
I have them open. I think one is tied to many of the San Mateo homes that are reaching
okay,
100 years old, that are dotted around the city. You know, what is the city doing to preserve them? And then the second question, let me find that one. Yeah, I think that's also related to preservation of homes that are close to 100 years old. Zach, do you want to take a stab at responding to those?
Sure. So yes, I think there's a lot of work to be done as we outlined in the general plan. We kind of ordered the actions within the historic resources section of that element in order of priority. I think the top priority is updating the city's historic preservation ordinance, then moving to preparation of a citywide context statement, and then forward with kind of survey, going throughout the city and starting to survey and develop and build our historic resources inventory. All of these steps take time, staff time and resources, and will need to be prioritized and funded. And so following the general plan update, the next step will really be looking to where these fit into the city's priority list and where we have staff resources and funding available to do them. So we definitely hear that they're a priority. And so I think really the key is following general plan adoption, looking at how we can then align for those, but we don't have a timeline when we proceed yet. So I think that kind of gets to Lisa's question about older homes. Any home over 50 years old that's proposed for substantial alteration or demolition would be evaluated with an HRV. So we are still looking at older structures like that if there is a significant project proposed on that site. But in terms of actually doing the inventory work or survey work, we don't know exactly when that will take place yet.
very good. Manera, was there another question from?
Yeah, there's some. Sorry, go ahead, Sean.
No, yeah, there was a second question from the participant.
No, I think it was the similar, in a similar vein about the, you know, homes that are more than 100 years old. So I think Zach answered that already. I did see one other question come in about where on the city's website can I find information about how to apply for a Mills Act credit and contract. So we did update our website, so please take a look at that. And, you know, you can direct your question directly to me or to the planning email that's online, and we'd be happy to assist you with the Mills Act process.
Okay, very good. A question that just came in, clarifying the comment about qualifying solely on the basis of age. Can the architectural historian, John, comment on the validity of Baywood being significant?
Sorry, looking for my mute here. I'm not familiar enough with the neighborhood of Baywood to offer a helpful assessment on that. Given my limited knowledge of that particular neighborhood.
Okay, very good. This is a next step. Confirm that creating a citywide historic ordinance is part of the city's 24-25 plan and doesn't need to be called out as part of blue sky discussion.
Zach, would you like to take that one, or should I? I think you touched on it a little bit.
So at this point, it's not, I mean, we don't know what the priorities for 24-25 are yet. But the next step that's clearly identified, this is part of the council's 23-24 priorities, is that priority was tied to the general plan, which was adding additional language and clarification about historic preservation, which was completed. And so now moving forward to adopt that. And then that general plan is our guiding document and will help us then set priorities moving forward. So I think I would just refer back to our next clear step is the general plan and adoption, and then using that to then guide prioritization moving forward.
Very good, thank you. Here's a question. All the buildings recently constructed and approved for construction in the downtown area are modern architecture, concrete, steel, and glass boxes. Question is, how is that in compliance with downtown as a historical district? Yeah, so that's the question. How does that comply with downtown being designated as a historical district?
Right, and Sean, I can speak to that a little bit, and Zach had touched on it earlier. So the Downtown Historic District is a specific part of downtown. It's the core of downtown, and it has a specific boundary. Most of these projects that are referenced here have been in the periphery of downtown, so they're not really immediately adjacent to downtown. And any new projects that come in that are adjacent to the Downtown Historic District, those are looked at carefully in terms of the Secretary of Interior standards, or to ensure that they don't cause an impact to the Downtown Historic District. I will also add that as part of the objective design standards that were adopted by Council, there is an objective design standard that allows for the development in the downtown area plan to be of the Spanish Revival style, because the community did raise a lot of concerns about the styles of architecture that were coming up in downtown, and staff and the Planning Commission, with Planning Commission's input, did develop a specific style of architecture that is for the entire downtown, not just for the historic district, but for the entire downtown.
There was a question here, or maybe a recommendation for the city to consider a demolition moratorium for any home over 75 years old. That's a question that the city would need to take up, and that city council would need to take up. And I don't believe we have any information on that at this meeting, and I don't believe that's under consideration by the city at this time. There was a question about exteriors, and does, if I can find the question here. Okay, no, I think that was another question. Since much of our city's homes are close to 100 years old, why isn't the city making preserving them more of a priority? And I think that also applies to what's happening with the general plan related to the historic district and the preservation ordinance and policies in the general plan. Yeah, there's the question about the moratorium. That's something that the city would need to take up. Will you be providing more detail on how the city will deal with 50+ year buildings? As I understand, it could be more detailed. I believe, again, that is part of the general plan update.
Sean, if I could chime in there on the process. So we do have a process when a project is located on a site that has a building that's more than 50 years old. So when it comes in for a planning application, we look at it, we do an HRE, a historic resources evaluation, to determine if it's a significant historic resource, if that site or that property was not covered in the 1989 survey. So yes, we do have a process in place for looking at projects when, you know, they haven't been surveyed before, and there's demolition proposed of homes that may be more than 50 years old.
Okay, very good.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question here. Do you have any experience with insurability of historic properties? Are there specific insurer requirements?
John or Sarah, do you want to address that? I don't think we are aware of anything.
I mean, I know that I believe that there may be some issues with particular materials. If this is what the question is is really trying to get at, like things like wood shingle roofs in particular locations that might have an impact on, I mean, or that might actually just be meeting fire code. So I guess I'm not aware of anything leaping to mind right now.
Okay.
And John, I think there was, and Sean, there was, I believe, a question earlier about property values, like if something is designated historic
Mhm.
or if there's a district, like, do you have any insight on that? My understanding was that it doesn't really affect property values. Like it evens out. There are some people who like to live in historic buildings and some who don't. So it kind of balances out. But do you have any take on that?
Well, I know there is research that exists on this question, and I feel like more of the consensus is that I've seen is that historic designation increases property values, but I couldn't say to what degree, and it definitely depends on the market and the locations. So I just know that there has been research that's found in some locations it's led to increased property values.
Okay. Okay, here's a question. The city process does not protect contributors to a district. That means the review of older homes does not protect all historic resources. Why is that?
If I can kind of provide a response to the night, Manira, you feel free to jump in. All homes that are over 50 years old are evaluated when there's proposals that could significantly alter or demolish that structure. If it's outside of a historic district, then if that structure does not meet the eligibility requirements for an ineligible historic resource, then that would not preclude the project from moving forward. So I think if there's a potential contributor in a potential historic district, we aren't going to necessarily look at that variable. We're going to look at evaluate that structure if it rises to the level of being eligible as an individual historic resource. And that would be determining whether we had to alter design or propose project to meet certain standards.
Very good. Thank you for that, Zach. And the last question, and this is related more specifically to the Baywood application, but I'll ask the question anyways. Will someone from the City of San Mateo's historic planning team be attending the Baywood Neighborhood Association meeting on February 16th? And we don't need, I'm not sure we even have an answer for that unless there's somebody from the historic planning team here.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anybody from staff attending that meeting. I don't think we were invited or we knew what the agenda was. So at this point, it's really hard for me to say if anybody's planning to go.
Okay.
Yeah, it's possible that's, somebody from another department might be going, but from CDD, I'm not aware of us attending at this point.
Okay, I do see Mayor Nash, the city manager, and mayor will attend the Baywood meeting, and that is from Mayor Nash. That is all the questions that we have. So unless there is anything else, I suggest that we move towards closing out the second part of our meeting here. Unless somebody has anything else to add before we wrap up. Okay, that again, general plan update in March, 2 council meetings, as Manira said, and do access the Historic Resources webpage and stay abreast of the information that's there. And I've been corrected that it was not Mayor Nash, but it was make sure I got that right. It was not Mayor Nash, but her husband. Okay, thank you for that, and I apologize for that mistake. So we are ready to wrap up. Thank you for the meeting, and thank you for all the questions. And stay tuned and plugged in as the process unfolds. And again, participate in the make your voice heard at the city council meetings in March. Thank you, and have a good evening.